Okay, so today we're going to look into biogeochemical cycles. So if you break down this word, biogeochemical cycles, let's break it down into what it means. So bio means living things or life. Geo, think of geography or geology. We're thinking of study of the earth. And chemicals, obviously chemistry, but we're looking at chemicals. And in this case, the chemicals we're going to be looking at are nutrients or just chemicals. And they're cycling. So we're cycling chemicals needed for life through the earth. That's just a big word that means that. We're going to, the earth, the environment cycles certain chemicals through. Basically, it's almost like recycling those chemicals. So they get used and they get made, they get used again, they get made again, back and forth. And you've seen examples of these cycles before. In earlier grades, I think even as early as maybe grade 5 or 6 or something like that, you go back and you're looking at something called the water cycle. And we know that water is cycled through our ecosystem. We have lakes and rivers and streams that are evaporating, and then eventually that evaporated water comes back and precipitates back down as rain. So we have water leaving and water returning. And this happens throughout the ecosystems with all sorts of different nutrients. And there's a couple of nutrients we're going to look at this year in particular. So this is just the process of cycling things through our environment. So again, you're probably familiar with the water cycle, and you have condensation and precipitation are the two major things that are happening in your water cycle, and that's just what sends the water out to the atmosphere and brings it back to the earth so it's usable again. Now, there's 3 cycles we're going to look at, and actually the first 2 are two halves of the same cycle, really. The first one is the carbon cycle. The next one is the oxygen cycle. They're really the same cycle, and you'll see why in a second. This shows us how carbon is moved through our ecosystem. Carbon is taken out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So plants take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. They take the carbon dioxide and they convert it into sugars. That's why they're an autotroph. They're a self-feeder. So they create sugars for their energy source. And then plants will change that glucose and other types of carbon compounds, so for growth and things like that. And there's your reaction. There's your photosynthesis reaction. So carbon dioxide and water makes sugar and oxygen using the sun's light. There's a thing on there called chlorophyll. That's just the part of the plant where this reaction actually takes place. And we should probably go back and balance this. So I believe there it ends up being a 6 there and a 6 there and a 6 there. Anyways. We return that carbon back to the atmosphere through respiration. Respiration is a fancy way of saying breathing. We breathe in oxygen gas and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So when we breathe in oxygen, we're reacting that oxygen with the sugars in the foods that we eat to create water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So plants are taking in energy and carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen and sugars, and we are taking in sugars and oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide and using that energy that's being produced. So if you actually look at it, it's the exact opposite process of photosynthesis. It's kind of an actual perfect balance back and forth. So if you look at these 2 reactions, they are basically the opposite of each other. Photosynthesis and respiration, exact opposites. There's a nice balance there between plants and animals. This is how carbon dioxide gets cycled back and forth between plants and animals. Now, there's another way that carbon gets put into the atmosphere, and that's through combustion. We learned that combustion reactions are always this. Some hydrocarbon plus oxygen makes CO2 and H2O. You can think of respiration as almost like a combustion reaction where our hydrocarbon is sugars. So we burn fossil fuels, and those fossil fuels create carbon dioxide, which goes back into the atmosphere. Remember, fossil fuels are just things that they're basically fuels from living things. So usually our fossil fuels that we burn are like gasolines and oils and things like that, and those come from dead dinosaurs, dead plant life, things that were living at one point in time that have died a long time ago. But you could also have just even combustion of forests. So a forest fire could be an example of a way to return carbon back to your atmosphere. So here's kind of a picture of how this goes. So you can see here's your combustion, putting carbon out. Here is your cellular respiration, putting carbon out. There's also one other one that we talked about, or we haven't talked about, is decomposition of things. So decomposition can also produce carbon dioxide. So when bacteria and things are breaking down plant and animal matter, it also releases CO2. The only way we get that CO2 back in into these organisms is through photosynthesis. So you have all these things putting CO2 out, but only one really bring it back in. Now, if you look at the oxygen cycle, it's actually the same cycle. It's just the other half of the coin, if you will. So plants are actually releasing oxygen, and organisms, living things, or animals, are using that oxygen to breathe. When we burn things, we're using oxygen to burn things. So it's the other side of that coin, if you will, of the carbon cycle. So there's your oxygen cycle. Now, the more difficult one is the nitrogen cycle, and it's, I don't want to say it's more difficult, but it's less familiar. We are more familiar with breathing and photosynthesis because we've heard about these things for a long time. Now, the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen is a super important element in all plant and animal matter. It's like kind of the building blocks of proteins, which is the building blocks of life. So most of your atmosphere, about 78% of the atmosphere, is actually nitrogen, but it's not in a form that plants and animals can use. You can't just take that nitrogen, because nitrogen, if you remember from chemistry, looks like this. If I have two nitrogens, they look like this. And if we want to put them together, these electrons can pair up. And what ends up happening is you get two nitrogens with triple bonds holding them together. And that triple bond is really hard to break. So nitrogen gas is super stable. And plants can't use it this way because it's too hard to break all three of those bonds. So the way I think of this is the nitrogen has to be fixed so it's usable, because it's not usable the way it is. So we have two processes, like we had combustion and respiration combustion versus photosynthesis in carbon cycle. Now we have nitrogen fixation and denitrification. They're just two opposite processes. So nitrogen fixing is how we take this nitrogen out of our atmosphere and fix it so that it can be used by plants. And denitrification is how we return that nitrogen to the atmosphere. Now, the ironic thing is, in order to fix the nitrogen, you've actually got to break that bond. That's how we fix it, is by breaking that bond. Now, nitrogen fixation is how we take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and make nitrates and ammonia, which is what plants use. So if you've ever put fertilizer on your lawn, you're usually putting on nitrates or ammonia, some sort of a nitrogen compound that the grass can use. Farmers do this all the time. Lots of farmers will add ammonia to their crops, and that's a usable form of nitrogen. You'd think, well, why can't the plants just use the nitrogen in the air? Well, because it's too hard to break down. So there are two ways that these things get naturally pulled out of the atmosphere, that nitrogen actually naturally gets converted to ammonia or nitrates. The first one is lightning. So when you have a lightning strike, it actually ionizes the nitrogen in our atmosphere, and it causes it to form nitrates. And then when you have rain, those nitrates get dissolved in the rain and fall to the ground. There are also certain bacteria that can do this on their own. So special plants called legumes actually have little nodules on their root system that contain bacteria, and those bacteria, we actually call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they will take the nitrogen in the air and convert it to nitrates so that the plant is able to use it. So it's kind of this little relationship where the bacteria are helping to feed those plants with nitrogen, fertilize those plants. So clover, alfalfa, soybeans is a pretty common crop, peas. These are all legumes, and it's because they have certain bacteria. They can fix their own nitrogen. You don't have to fertilize these crops as often or as much. Then the plants will take those nitrates and ammonias and convert it to proteins, and then we'll use those proteins for our life processes. Now, animals will eat those plants, convert it into the animal proteins that allow us to build muscles and things like that. When we all die, when all the living things die, the decomposers will break down our remains, and some of the bacteria and fungi that are breaking us down will decay those proteins back into nitrates and ammonias, and then it'll be used again to make proteins. Now, there are other bacteria that will take those nitrates and ammonias and release them back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas, and we call this denitrification. So we're removing nitrogen from the soil and sending it back to the atmosphere. This is the opposite process of nitrogen fixing. This also happens with like sewage, waste. That decomposition of it will actually release that nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere. So here's your process where lightning is converting nitrogen gas into nitrogen nitrates and ammonia. And then we also have nitrogen fixing bacteria that are converting nitrogen gas into nitrates and ammonia. We have denitrifying bacteria that are sending it back into the atmosphere, and some decaying organic matter sending it back into the atmosphere. So we have our nitrogen fixing and denitrification are two opposing processes.